Good evening and welcome to everyone here in person and welcome to everybody online. This is the second Science at Melbourne's lecture for the year, and it is a delight to finally be back in person. Thank you for being here and joining in the conversation. Tonight we are here to talk about biodiversity. More specifically, the biodiversity crisis that is seeing the rapid loss of much-loved species and the destruction and degradation of ecosystems and natural habitats. In keeping with tonight's topic, it is appropriate that we reflect on the care of the lands that we stand on by the traditional owners and custodians. This is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. It was that careful country over tens of thousands of years that has endowed to current generations Australia's wonderful plants, animals and landscapes, some of which you'll hear about today. I acknowledge and respect the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as this country's first scientists with deep and enduring knowledge of the lands, waters and skies, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I welcome all First Nations people joining us here today. So why is there a biodiversity crisis? How big is this challenge and what does it mean for the way we live today? And what does it hold for future generations if we fail to act? Most importantly, what can we do to avoid or mitigate the crisis? Tonight, the panel will approach these questions looking through the lenses of biosciences, ecology, zoology, and Indigenous history and culture. You will have an opportunity to have your say and to ask your questions, so please have them ready when we get to that time at the end. I am now thrilled to introduce today's expert panel, starting with Amanda Martin, who will reside as a moderator tonight. Amanda Martin OAM is the Chief Executive Officer and Secretary to the Board of the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network. Amanda has worked in the conservation sector for over 20 years and in a range of practice areas from community group development management, protected area policy and planning, advocacy, fundraising and philanthropy. She helped establish and now leads the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network, which is a group of over 100 individuals and foundations with a focus on environmental philanthropy. Joining Amanda tonight are a panel of experts who are leaders in their respective areas. They are Professor Brendan Wintle, who is a global leader in conservation ecology here at the University of Melbourne. We have Dr Jenny Gray, who is the CEO of Zoos Victoria, and we have Dr Jack Pascoe, who is a conservation and research manager at the Conservation Ecology Centre. Thank you to all our panel members. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and I will now hand over to Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks, Moira, and I'd like to thank the University of Melbourne and the Department of Science for putting on this lecture series. It's been terrific so far and I'm looking forward to tonight. And I would also like to recognise the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people all around the country, because I know there are people from all over Australia here tonight, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and like Moira also pay tribute to our First Nations friends for being the stewards of this beautiful country for tens of thousands of years. We're going to discuss a topic that's very close to my heart, and I suspect it's close to all of yours as well. In the room and online we have academics, we have students, we've got government representatives, we've got scientists, public servants, non-government organisation people, people from all over Australia that care about our natural world. So it's really a great privilege to be in the room with all of you tonight. Have you enjoyed the stunning photos tonight? I hope you have. They've been beautiful. I've enjoyed watching them before you all came along. We are so very lucky here in Australia to have inherited this diverse, spectacular, intriguing country of plants, animals, fungi, spiders, algae, birds, and nudibranchs. And you might be asking about nudibranchs. Why might I be mentioning nudibranchs? Well, they're my very favourite animal, and hopefully you can see them up there. They are sea slugs, and they lead the world in fashion, art and sci-fi madness, don't you think? Check them out. Their gills are displayed on top of their head like some weird 20s feather boa, and the colours would be the envy of any Parisian catwalk. And they are a lot like birds in that they are indicators of ecosystem health. And they have been a part of my journey into falling in love with the natural environment when I was a young woman starting to snorkel in the bay. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So before we get any further, the format for this evening, Moira's already mentioned, we'll be introducing the topic. I'll introduce our rockstar speakers. And then we'll be giving you a bit of a chance to ask questions. Whether you're here in the room or online, you can ask some questions. I've got somebody who's got their hand up.
I just wondered if it's possible to reduce the lighting on the front so we can see your lovely slides more clearly.
No. I'm told no. Maybe we can do it a little bit later at the end of the night, because I understand they are spectacular. So, to the topic of this evening, our biodiversity, as most of you know, is in very, very grave danger. And I'm just going to give you a few statistics. In Australia, we have at least 104 native species go extinct since European colonisation, and there are another 1,800 species listed at risk of extinction nationally. 1,800. And species recently thought to be safe, such as the bogong moth, the charismatic gang cockatoo, and even our iconic koala, are being added to the global and national threatened species list following drought, flood, catastrophic fires and habitat destruction. We wouldn't have guessed this 10 years ago, but it's happening now. A recent analysis shows that 19 ecosystems around the country are on the brink of collapse, including, as you know, the Great Barrier Reef, Shark Bay seagrasses in Western Australia, the Southern Australia's unique marine kelp forests, the magnificent alpine and mountain ash forests right on Melbourne's doorstep that provide us with the best drinking water in the world, and the Murray-Darling Basin's waterways and riverine systems that nourish our national food bowl. In Australia, there are countless reports that track this decline and why, and make recommendations for turning this trajectory around. There's a 5-yearly State of the Environment report put together by a bevy of the best Australian, some here in this university, best Australian scientists, and we are still waiting to view the most recent version, I think. Is that right, Brendan? Yes, we're still waiting on that. So stay tuned. There's the review of the federal government's main piece of environmental legislation, the Environment Conservation Protection Biodiversity Act, which is a bit of a mouthful. It was conducted by businessman Graham Samuel in 2020. It detailed a litany of failures and a bucket load of solutions. Yet our federal government has decreased funding to the environment by 40%. And our states give minimal funding to biodiversity protection too. So tonight we will explore why this is happening and what we're at risk of losing. So how are you feeling? Have I just made you feel pretty depressed? I'm sorry if that's the case, but it's the reality that we have to face. But I'm here to tell you that we are at a moment in time when we can change this trajectory. We can change the course of history. The recent election shows that the majority of Australians want change in how we manage and protect our planet. And the solutions exist. We have world-renowned expertise in this area here in Australia, a groundswell of demand for change. And a big thank you to all of you scientists, practitioners, public servants, volunteers and other good folk who have helped steward our biodiversity estate. So yeah, Good on you. Thank you very much for that. Woohoo! So let's begin. As Moira's already said, we're joined by a stellar group of speakers tonight. Jack, do you want to put your hand up? Wave at everybody.
I was hoping that the stellar lineup would rock up. So.
Jack, Jenny and Brendan. So I'm going to start with some questions, and I'm going to start with you, Jenny. Can you tell us in just a minute or so your favourite plant or animal and a bit about how it relates to your career?
So my favourite animal is a human man called Richard, who's here this evening. He's been married to me for 30 years. And as a zoo director, I'm not really supposed to have favourites, but in answering this question, if I'm going to single out a species instead of an individual, it would be mantas, oceanic manta ray. You know, this is a blue planet. It's covered in water, and the water controls the climate. The ecosystems we live within are so dependent on what happens there, and we know so little about it. And we've been avid scuba divers for our whole lives, and over 30 years watched the change in the ocean. And there's this moment where you're sitting watching a magnificent creature like a manta just glide past you in so much grace and so much poise in the water column, only to see a plastic bag pass it. Mm. And it reminds you of both how magnificent it is and how treacherous we are all in one moment.
Mm. Beautiful, thank you. What about you, Brendan? What's your favourite creature?
Thanks, Amanda. And I realised that I was given the option now of a plant, and unfortunately I've chosen an animal, so I feel I feel like I've missed an opportunity there. But I'm going to talk about the bogong moth. Mm. It's a fairly unassuming looking creature compared to a lot of other threatened species. You might say it's even perhaps a tiny bit dour, even compared to this other invertebrate up here that's incredibly fascinating looking. The bogong moth is a really cool species. Billions of bogong moths emerge out of the cracking clay soils at the end of every winter. They turn themselves into rather unimpressive looking moths through their pupation, and then they all fly over 1,000 kilometres to a place that they've never been, that back to where their parents spent the previous summer, into the Victorian and New South Wales Alps. And they just go there to be cool, which is an incredible dedication to being cool, I think, for a little moth. And as well as being cool, they have, of course, a keystone species. They bring crucial food for very many animals in the Alps, including mountain pygmy possums, who are a highly threatened mammal in the alpine areas, but also all of the other lizards and mammals and birds and other creatures that need the moths to arrive. Without the moths, we would probably see dramatic changes to alpine ecosystems. They're of immense cultural significance to very many First Nations peoples. They were totemic for several groups in Victoria, including the Yatmathang people, the Tongarong people, the Gunai people, and of course, a really important part of cultural heritage. Unfortunately, the bogong moths are plummeting. They've now been listed as endangered under the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They'll probably be soon listed as threatened here in Australia under our EPBC Act. They're just a little brown moth, and when they fly back from their cool place in the Alps to go back up to the north, they're pushing against the wind, and I can really relate to that sometimes.
Thanks, Brendan. And what about you, Jack?
I'm going to cheat. I'm going to talk about a place. I'm a wildlife biologist by trade, but never been much of a bunny hugger. So I guess my interest in place started before I was born, when my mother was pregnant with me, and my mother and father were on the point of Point Franklin on Cape Otway, and a right whale breached about 3 metres from the rock platform that they were standing on, which has become an important part of my yarn. And then I grew up in the woodlands of Cape Otway. To the best of our knowledge, it means Bungarak is its language name, and it means dune or knees of sand. And it refers to the windswept shape of the country there. And I ran up grow up. I grew up running through that country. Hard to imagine running through woodlands and forests of Australia or southeast Australia at the moment because they're so regularly scrubby. But I was able to do that as a boy. I then went away for a while and did some study, and came back and have spent the last decade trying to look after that place and restore it to what I remembered as a kid. I got married on Blanket Bay, which is on Cape Otway, and I still live on Gadiminot country, which is the King Parrot tongue speaking mob, one of the 5 language groups of the Ma. So I cheat and incorporate everything, Amanda, basically. And, I have an obligation to look after that place. It's not Yuin country, which is my traditional country, but very important to me.
Yeah, important. Country and species, they go hand in hand, right?
They do.
Thank you. And so, Brendan, I've already talked a little bit about the biodiversity crisis, but can you tell us a little bit more about what is happening and what have we got to lose?
Yeah, look, the biodiversity crisis is real. It's probably the number 2 existential crisis that we face as a species alongside climate change. At the moment, taking a global perspective, we're seeing extinction rates at 100 to 1,000 times the background extinction rates that you can observe in the fossil record. The United Nations Environment Programme published a report, a global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services at the end of 2019 that identified over 1 million species at risk of extinction globally. That includes vertebrates and invertebrates. And while we're talking about invertebrates, we're seeing evidence of invertebrate decline in Europe, of biomass declines across Germany of 75% in 30 years. So this sort of insect Armageddon is part of this biodiversity crisis, and it's easy to see how that relates to our own existence and our own ability to grow foods. So we're seeing such a spike in extinction rates. That's the greatest spike in extinction rates since the extinction of the dinosaurs. And so that's why we're now referring to this as the Anthropocene human-driven extinction event. And that's largely driven globally by land use change and degradation. A startling statistic in that global assessment was that we've lost, since 1700, 85% of all wetlands. So all wetlands that existed in 1700, we only have 15% left, which is just astonishing to me. 75% of all terrestrial lands have been significantly altered. And of course, here in Australia, we have a very special and unfortunate relationship with extinction. Following colonisation of Europeans in Australia, the dispossession of First Nations peoples of their land, loss of cultural land management, we've seen immense damage and change to those lands. Modern agriculture has led to a massive clearing and habitat loss. Here in Victoria, for example, we've totally lost 66% of the native vegetation that existed in Victoria before European colonisation. And this is not a historical thing either. This is something that's happening now. Since 2000, we've actually seen the loss of 8 million hectares, an area much bigger than the size of Tasmania, in actual threatened species habitats lost. 93% weren't even assessed under the EPBC Act as to whether they represented critical habitats. So, this massive change in landscapes compounded by the introduction of invasive species, both herbivores, invasive predators, cats and foxes. We hear statistics about, cats taking 1 million birds a day, 360 million birds a year taken by cats alone, 60 million of those a year taken by domestic cats. So this kind of impact on ecosystems, it's not surprising that in Australia we are responsible for 30% of all mammal extinctions. We've lost 10% of our mammal fauna since European colonisation, and of you note 104 species listed as extinct. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. These are the species that we notice, the things that we describe as Western scientists. It very rarely includes tiny little plants that are hard to notice, almost any invertebrates. So that 104, I think, is probably the tip of the iceberg. I think there's pretty widespread recognition of that. And we're already seeing, just out of the Black Summer fires, a suite of invertebrates that are now being thought of as potentially extinct just from that one, season. So yes, we are in a biodiversity crisis. This is existential for us, and probably we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But on a scale of 1 to 10, we're close to 10.
And here in Australia, where, as you just described, we're seeing that we're at the front of that, I suppose. So, Jack, what do you think we're doing wrong? There's a lot of things that Brendan's already mentioned, but what are the things that we are seeing within your work that we're doing wrong that's leading to this extinction crisis?
I think there's a hell of a lot of ways to answer that in some ways, but I'll answer it this way. So I reached out to Uncle Dave Wandon this morning, who's a Wurundjeri elder, to say I was coming on Wurundjeri country and I was giving a presentation, and he said something along the lines of, "Good on you, mate. I know you've got to present as an ecologist, but give him a bit of the Black Feliway too, eh?" And because I'm an ordinary ecologist, I thought, well, let's start with the Black Feliway then. So I think as a bit of a culture, this culture, we've separated ourselves from biodiversity in country. And I think really that's at the root of a lot of our problems. As soon as we do that, it's easy to see the biodiversity crisis as something that's happening in national parks and out there, but we're part of country and we can't take that away. And Uncle Dave tells that yarn about Bunjil's first law. This is Kulin Nation, this is Bunjil country, and Bunjil's first law is to look after country like it's your mother, your blood and flesh mother. Now, if you accept that as a culture, and that you have to accept that you have kinship with the mother, everything you do has to reflect that. Now, I don't want you to take this as an analogy of for those few of us whose mothers are in homes, etc., and you might see them once a month. I want you to really reflect on the fact that this is a relationship with our mother that needs to be intimate and close for us to really understand that biodiversity is something we're related to and a part of. Then there's a whole lot of technical things that we can talk to about how we're managing land, and I know our minds often go to national parks and places of forests. But it's quite a similar way of thinking across many First Nations, Yuin people. When we're saying anything that's worth saying, Natchatangunga, through the mother, in acknowledgement of the mother and as mother as our witness, anything important that's worth saying, we're doing it in the presence of mother. And again, I'll reiterate, once you start to take that perspective on life, all of the decisions that you make in your day-to-day lives as you go about it, you can't help but respect and look after country. And it's by that I think we'll make the greatest strides. I think we need to take on Indigenous knowledge and the best science that we can to address some of the really difficult challenges of land management across Victoria. But I think first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that biodiversity is not something out there, it is something that we're a part of, and the country won't look after itself. It needs us to help.
And Jack, do you think that's changing at the moment? Do you feel that the community is picking up on the lead from First Nations people? And one of the things that I've noticed is since the fires, there's a lot more conversation about proper fire management, for example. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's a real acknowledgement that we maybe haven't got things quite right.
Yeah.
And maybe that the oldest living culture on earth that has taken away its country, which was as biodiverse as the things as Brendan has just talked about. We need to acknowledge that system of land management, of caring for mother, was the reason for that biodiverse. Not only was it highly productive, and man can talk about the food productivity and what early settlers were witness to, but it was also this biodiverse place. And I think this partitioning of country into, that's forest and that's for agriculture, we need to really think this through. I think expecting a traditional land management to solve all our problems with fire management is incredibly unfair. It wasn't a cultural practice that created these problems for us. And so expecting a cultural practice to come in without support is unfair. But it absolutely has a really vital role to play. And I think as much as anything, it's about the principles that we can take away from the way First Nations lived in respect for the mother.
Excellent, thank you. And Brendan, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday. You had some thoughts too around what's going on and why we're in this crisis. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, and this feels kind of a bit shallow after what Jack's just said, but you know, I think we've actually seen repeatedly now recognition through official reviews, through Senate inquiries, the Graham Samuel review, as you talked about, around our environment legislation. We are failing to properly resource the conservation of our biodiversity and our natural heritage. We spend nationally around $120 million a year on threatened species conservation, and we estimate that we probably need to up that to around $1.5 to $2 billion a year on threatened species conservation in order to be able to hang on to that list of 1,800 species that are identified as at high risk of extinction at the moment. So that sounds like a fair bit of money, right? $1.5 to $2 billion a year, but it is worth reflecting that last year, as a nation, we spent $30.7 billion just on caring for our cats and our dog pets. So just to put that in perspective, and of course, you know, we spent $5 billion on not getting submarines and a bunch of other things. So there's a whole bunch of comparisons you can draw here. But you know, even if we just use the GST from our cat and dog care, we could actually provide $3 billion a year to conserve our natural heritage, and I think that's probably money pretty well spent. So yeah, I guess at the moment those reviews have identified a lack of resourcing and also a lack of responsible regulation and actually making sure we've got some good rules. Let's actually enforce them. Let's actually avoid ongoing loss of vegetation and ongoing degradation of country and sort of get these things right. So look, I'm optimistic that we're perhaps entering a new time in both resourcing and environmental management and responsible regulation, but let's see. Got a long way to go.
Yeah. And so to that question of resourcing, Jenny, you must be facing this question regularly as a manager of the zoos in Victoria. How do we make those decisions around the best way of allocating resources?
Yeah, it's as Brendan says, it's kind of like the wrong question first, is how do we allocate the scarce resources we have? The right question is, why don't we have the right resources? Why is this not a priority? I have a very brave board who about a decade ago made what we call our Fighting Extinction commitment, which is that no Victorian terrestrial vertebrate species will go extinct on our watch. And we won't let species slip away, and we don't think anyone should. You know, here in Victoria, we punch above the weight class. You talk about 1,800 species that are threatened with extinction. We're ahead of the pack. We're on 1,995. That's not the side of the ledger we want to be on. But that's 1,995 species in Victoria threatened with extinction. Now, Fern and I did a bit of work around those 1,995. And here's the good news. Half of them are going to be very hard to save, but half of them are just going to be difficult. So we can move the dial on half of those. They've done some work and found out that about 73 are actually close to a threshold where we could downlist them by one category. If we have an audience of about 2,000 people here and online, all we need to do is for each of us to put up our hand and prioritize and say, I will save the small flowered snotty gobble. I've got that one. You can all look for something else. But of those 1,500 about our plants, surely we can save them. Surely we shouldn't be asking to prioritize. We should be saying, how do we create an army of people that stand up and say, I will learn about the species, I will commit to it, and I will fight for it. Because what is this country going to be without the creatures that make it so special? Which one would we let go? I can't think of a single one that I would say, well, maybe a cat and a fox and a few others. But what would we really say it's okay they don't exist anymore? Even those animals are fabulous in their own environment. And it's not their fault we brought them here. So how do we prioritize? We get smart. We use science. We use law. We listen. We listen with open minds. And then we take action. And for me, that's the big part of how do we bring action back to each and every one of us? How do we come back into our backyards? How do we plant butterfly and invert food in our own backyards, in our own parks, in our own cemeteries? This is not work for someone else. We've almost outsourced conservation because we're fearful to take it on ourselves and fearful of not winning. I think we need to be brave, and we need to be bold, and we need to say we're going to stand up. At Zoos Victoria, we said we stand for 27 critically endangered species. Of those, at least 4 or 5 would be extinct if we didn't do the work we're doing at the moment. They would be gone already. That's an incredibly scary thought. And I don't think we should wait for anything else to be gone. We should be working on each and every species. Come on, from this Melbourne Uni, we have enough people that we should be falling over each other. We should be teams of people trying to save each one of those 2,000 species. And by save, I don't mean let's talk about what they were like before settlement. That's going to be a difficult discussion. I mean, just move them one step away from extinction. If they're critically endangered, make them endangered. If they're endangered, make them vulnerable. There's clear thresholds, there's clear ways of moving, and all of it's based on science and based on knowledge.
So while we're talking about activity, I know you've got a really great example of shifting something that was almost extinct. Do you want to give us that example, please?
Yeah, in terms of what we can do, and when we say let's do this, people go, well, let's prove it. It's like we've already done that. And so the eastern barred bandicoot was listed as extinct in the wild in Victoria. It still persists in Tasmania, but it was extinct in the wild here in Victoria. And in an incredible consortium over 35 years, people have been working on the species. But pretty much a big consortium, 20 different organizations from Parks Victoria, the department, ARI, the uni, Odonata, ourselves, the French Island Primary School. Everyone gets behind the eastern barred bandicoot, and we head towards a really clear target of 3 freestanding populations with more than 1,500 animals in the wild. That's the threshold that we wanted to get over to be well and clear into endangered. And it took a while, but last year the eastern barred bandicoot was downlisted because we have 3 freestanding populations, not behind fences, they are on islands. We've got to the point where we no longer are breeding them in captivity for release to back up the population because there's enough animals in the wild to support themselves. We're not going to walk away and we're not going to wash our hands of them. But I'm incredibly proud of this work that's been done. Donors, academics, little children have all put up their hands to help the eastern barred bandicoot. And so now we just have to do it again and again and again. 2,000 times, well, 1,995. And let's throw in a few totems because I think there's some other animals that may not be endangered the way we think of them, but certainly need some more care and attention from us. Let's put together that. But yes, I'm incredibly proud of the work that a community have done. And we as Victorians should be proud of this. We brought a species back from extinct in the wild to a point where they're now living in really strong numbers back in the wild.
Yeah, it's a fantastic story. And I know 20 years ago, I was the head of the Victorian National Parks Association, and we campaigned for a new set of marine national parks across the Victorian coastline. And it was one of those things that I felt as a community we achieved and still exists and is protecting all those nudibranchs and fish and crayfish and all the things that live in the marine national parks. It's a great legacy that organisation and the community has left behind. There are so many things that we can do to turn this around. Brendan, I know you've got some great examples too of what you've done to achieve protection. So do you want to talk a little bit about what? Look,
I'll try and be really quick. I mean, it's part of the responsibility, I think, of us all to if we have to get political, write letters, think about voting for people who are going to do the right thing by biodiversity. I was fortunate enough to go be asked to be on the Australian Forestry Standard Reference Committee just because I was a scientist here working under with Mark Bergman, and they asked him and he couldn't do it, so they asked me. And I ended up on this reference group, and it turned out that I was able to have a veto vote on the Australian Forestry Standard because that's the way the ISO standards work. And it turned out they wanted to make the conversion of native forest into plantation something that could be certified sustainable under that standard, which no forester or scientist would agree is a sustainable practice. And so we were able to say no to that just by virtue of being there, sitting on a committee that otherwise was quite boring. And so you have to participate and take those opportunities, and they are opportunities that do come up as a scientist. And that meant that they stopped a lot of their conversion of native forest to plantations because they wanted to be able to get their paper and pulp mill certified sustainable. So you can get lucky sometimes, but you're not going to get lucky unless you really participate, I think, and be part of the broader activities of society.
Yeah, and have a little bit of courage and a bit of vision, as you said, Jenny, as well. Jack, what about you? Have you got an example of something that you've participated in or you've watched that has really made a difference?
I think probably the project that I've been involved in that I'm most proud of is a really small scale thing, really, in the grand scheme of things, and it's the restoration of Cape Otway's woodlands. So 10, 15 years ago, when I sort of came back to the Otway region, the forests had really collapsed. The trees had gone and the understory had taken over. And it was shocking. I mean, I'd watched it over a number of years, but what a change that beautiful place had undergone. And then over the course of a decade, we've planted trees. We've re-established a fire regime to try and encourage the biodiversity to come back. And we were awful at it to begin with. We were, planting 70,000 trees a year and watching most of them die because it's sand country, and it took us a while to get it right. And I think we're slowly getting there. As I said, it's sand country, so the trees grow insanely small, but slowly. But they're now bigger than I am, and I think probably before I die, someone will wheel me out there and there'll be a forest. So I think from the big to the small, those things where you can really learn a piece of country, so you're in a position to look after it in the best way you can.
Yeah, and persistence.
Yeah, and hard work, and my back's probably never going to be what it was.
So, Brendan, a question for you around what is it that we're going to lose when we talk about biodiversity? Obviously there's all these beautiful creatures that we all get a great sense of joy, and there's other things that we get from biodiversity. Can you tell us a little bit about all those benefits that biodiversity gives us?
Yeah, look, I think there's, biodiversity, animals and plants, they're part of our national identity. We all relate to them. They're part of cultural identity in many instances. It's also our responsibility, in a sense, to hand on to future generations the amazing nature and environment that we've been lucky enough to grow up with and enjoy. And when we let a species go extinct, we're sort of effectively stealing from future generations the opportunity to witness or see that species. I guess at a more pragmatic level, we rely on biodiversity in fundamental ways. There are no food systems without pollinators. In fact, people have estimated that pollination is worth, $560 billion a year to the world economy. That's probably the least of our concerns if we lose pollination and we see mass dislocation of people due to famine. So, there's so many ways that you can identify. I recently, CSIRO scientists led a study that indicated there were 19 ecosystems across Australia that were showing serious signs of collapse, including the Great Barrier Reef, the amazing tall mountain forests just east of here. And of course, the Great Barrier Reef is worth $6 billion a year just in the tourism revenue, never mind all of the, the fish species that grow out of the reef. Our Central Highlands forests are the crucial source of clean water that allows us to have the best drinking water on the planet in this city. Itself been estimated as worth over $1 billion a year just to our state economy. So these things are, I guess, economic valuations. Only natural ecosystems are the only viable carbon sink. So we can't possibly think about sinking the 12 gigatons of carbon a year that we need to sink in order to lower our atmospheric carbon levels. So we have to rely on natural systems and the restoration of natural systems to provide us with that service that basically keeps us safe from the worst impacts of climate change. So you can look at it spiritually, you can look at it pragmatically, you can look at it economically. We are fundamentally reliant on biodiversity, and so even just in terms of grubby self-interest, we should be doing our best to conserve these species and ecosystems.
Do you want to add anything to that, Jenny?
Yeah, I think we'll still have animals around us because there's lots of animals that like living with us. But imagine the only animals you ever saw were seagulls and rats. I mean, that would be probably what we deserve if we carry on like this. But, you know, I do get that moment of, yes, living is important and all the things Brendan talked about, but the aesthetic loss, the almost vandalism of throwing away this great beauty, just, I don't know how we put a value on that.
Yeah. What about you, Jack?
Yeah, look, I think one of the really important things for us to look at is when we're managing these bits of country, and, you know, why not grubby self-interest? But it's to look at the whole thing and you know, the functions that they service, but to see the species as part of country and the whole thing, and manage the whole thing, and to, instead of coming from a point of weakness and deficit, to build the strength in our ecosystems and country, of which we're a part of. And I very strongly believe that that's the way forward for management. By no means am I saying that we don't need to do drastic measures to save critically endangered species, but to look after pieces of country and to understand those pieces of country in a way well enough to preserve them is the challenge, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so we're at this critical moment in time. There is some low-hanging fruit that I think you've all been thinking about. Do you want to share some of those opportunities that exist right now to make a difference? Jenny, have you got some examples?
I would call on people to collaborate. You know, we do our best work together. We're a social creature. And I look at some of projects like the EBB, where we worked with private sector organisations like Odonata, with trusts and foundations. How do we just keep linking up? When we raft, we're going to do better. I was reading through some award nominations before I came through today and looking at, oh my goodness, there's these incredible scientists out there working one species by one species. How do we network? How do we link up? Because I think that's where the low-hanging fruit is, where my snotty gobbles and whatever it is Brendan's saving, when we can find that overlap, and so it's not that we're trying to take from each other. We're not competing, we're not fragmented. I think the biggest tragedy is how much we constantly splinter and fragment and end up as isolated pockets working alone in competition.
Yeah.
Even the way we get funding is all in competitive grants.
Yeah.
And so we're almost day by day set up to compete with each other instead of set up to work together. Nobody has an interest in the planet being ruined.
Yeah, so deeper collaboration.
Collaborations and changing the way we, you know, I love it when donors, for example, say, 4 of you come together, we don't want to see you on your own.
Yeah.
They encourage us to collaborate, don't set us up to compete. There's so many ways we can get better collaborations.
Yeah, I think you called it rafting, which I love. I haven't heard that
Otters
one before.
do that, don't you know, where otters all hold on to each other, and so suddenly, you know, if you're on your own on the ocean as a sea otter, that's a bit scary.
Yeah.
But if you just hold the one next to you and they hold the next one, before you know it, you've got a carpet of otters. It's
gorgeous. What about you, Jay?
I want to jump on that bandwagon. I think it's a really good way of answering. I think it's really easy, even across what is a really poorly funded industry, to segregate ourselves and do our own little bit badly, when in fact we could be studying our little thing, you know, for conservation, and the government could then burn that bit of country in a way that doesn't help it at all, and we're, you know, really arguing with ourselves. Together, we have a chance and an opportunity to learn from each other, and an opportunity for Western science to work with traditional knowledge, NGOs to play a role. I couldn't support that enough. I think as individual organisations and people, we are in a lot of strife, but all of the best outcomes I've ever seen have been through great collaboration. an open mind.
Excellent, thank you. And Brendan?
Yeah,
low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, low-hanging fruit. I think, you know, when you hear that we're going to have targets like net zero by 2050 in terms of, you know, net carbon emissions, there's a huge opportunity there. I mean, big companies, governments around the world are looking for places to restore and secure carbon, and you can do that in a really rubbish way for biodiversity, or you can do that in a good way. And I think that there's a huge opportunity now for us to help provide the tools and the knowledge and the understanding, and I mean in a joined up and cross-cultural way, what those opportunities are to help grow and secure our carbon stocks in ways that are really positive for biodiversity. I think that's hugely important. Again, staying at the sort of big picture level, we've got, I think, nearly 100 of the world's largest finance organisations have now signed a pledge to make their investments biodiversity positive. And we're talking about, you know, $15 trillion worth of assets of companies. That, if we can harness that goodwill, and I don't doubt that that is all based on good intention, then that's huge. If you've got groups like AXA or Rabobank saying, we're not going to invest in a coal mine, we're going to invest in you know, renewable energies. They're already doing that. We're not going to invest in these projects that are damaging to biodiversity. We're going to invest in projects that are positive for biodiversity. That could change the way we do business, because basically these finance organisations facilitate the world economy. And the big banks, they're ag banks and they're big project banks. So there's a huge opportunity if we can help those organisations harness that goodwill, so that we really do see biodiversity positive investment, not just greenwashing, because that's the downside risk of all this, of course. So we have to find ways to make that a true benefit.
Yeah, collaborating with the financial sector.
And also helping bring, you know, we have to help define what biodiversity positive is. There's a huge role for this institution and other similar organisations. What is biodiversity positive investment? That varies across different types of sectors. How do we measure it? You know, how do we report on it? These are still really big questions that we have to collectively address, and huge opportunities for science and research organisations.
Yeah. I know I'm front facing to a lot of people with wealth or the sort of financial world, and I'm always struck about the goodwill that exists there, but the need to be able to provide a language and the opportunities for people to participate in positive outcomes for conservation. So I think all of you and the academic world has a particularly important role in helping build those bridges. I'm going to wrap up, but before I do, I've been asked to try and summarise the conversation that we've just had, which is a little bit difficult, but what I am going to say is a couple of things that I am taking away from this conversation. The first thing is we are at this critical moment, and I think you're all here because you know that, and you would agree with that. One of the things that I heard tonight that is really important is the need to collaborate and not to compete. And I think we saw that playing out in the recent elections. I think that there is a demand for that in terms of how we address this biodiversity crisis. And particularly from Jack, that need to engage with Mother Earth, to reconnect to country, to find our space where our heart can really connect to the environment, I think is critically important. To bring our children along, to bring our friends along in that journey as well. But we heard a lot about action, and we often say at the AEGN that action is the antidote to despair. And so I think that taking action, whatever it mightn't be the silver bullet, but I think that action needs to connect to your heart, but also to your head. And so doing things, Brendan, I love what you said, join one of the friends groups. There are amazing groups out there, as I've already said, but get your hands dirty. I think that's your first thing. And the second thing is be political. This will not change without us being political. So use your intellect, use your nous, use your academic training, use your influence, and be political, because without being that, using our courage to be political, we're not going to get anywhere. So I think that that's my little summary. How did I go? Is that okay? Hopefully it worked for you. But before we do wrap up, please, can you put your hands together to thank Brendan, Jack and Jenny for their conversation tonight, and particularly for their work. I think it's really important for all of us to recognise that some of this work is not always easy, and I really want to pay tribute to the three of you, because you are really leaders in the sector in Australia and globally. So let's put our hands together for our speakers.